the day the border froze over. There was a time not long ago when Canadians didn't think twice about hopping across the border for gas, groceries, or a weekend at Target, when American tourists were as common on Queen Street as Tim Hortons cups, when economic partnership between Canada and the United States wasn't just policy, it was daily life. That era is over.
If you're done watching corrupt elites rig the system and leave you behind, subscribe now. If you want real talk, raw truth, and zero spin, this is your channel. If you're ready to fight back, hit that subscribe button and stand with us.
Donald Trump didn't just disrupt trade agreements. He shattered trust. With the stroke of a pen and a barrage of tweets, he slapped Canada with brutal 25% tariffs on vehicles and raw materials. No warning, no consultation, just punishment, an economic gut punch dressed up as patriotism. But what Trump failed to understand, what he never understands, is that Canada doesn't fold. It adapts. It rebuilds. And in this case, it fought back with quiet fury. Tariffs, trade, and the toll on Canadian industry. The automotive industry was the first casualty. Plants that had been seamlessly integrated across Detroit and Ontario for decades were suddenly paralyzed. Supply chains snarled. Production costs skyrocketed. Investment dried up. Small parts manufacturers, Canadian family-owned businesses, were forced to lay off workers or shut down entirely. And for what? To protect American jobs? To intimidate an ally? Trump's tariffs were a political stunt masquerading as policy, and the damage was real. What Trump didn't count on was the economic boomerang. His tariffs on Canada hit American auto workers, too. U.S. companies dependent on Canadian components saw their margins shrink and their stock prices fall. As prices climbed, demand fell. Thousands of American workers in states like Michigan and Ohio faced pink slips, victims of Trump's tariff tantrum. Boycott Nation. How Canada turned its wallet into a weapon. What started as frustration quickly turned into a movement. Across Canada, shoppers began skipping American brands. Flights to U.S. cities declined. Family vacations to Florida turned into camping trips in Banff. The message was clear. If Washington wanted a war, it's going to cost them. And this wasn't just symbolic. Billions of dollars that once flowed into American border towns stayed home. Malls in Buffalo and gas stations in Bellingham felt the pinch. The economic interdependence that once tied both nations together now became a pressure point. And Canada was pulling away. This wasn't just about dollars. It was about dignity. Canadians were insulted, and they responded not with protest signs, but with credit cards. Economic nationalism became the new patriotism. Carney's counterstrike. Leadership without fireworks. While Trump was lighting matches, Mark Carney was laying bricks. There were no screaming headlines. No made-for-TV drama. Just calm, calculated strategy. Carney convened business leaders, economists, and provincial premiers. His goal? To firewall Canada's economy from the chaos next door. He fast-tracked trade agreements with Europe. He deepened ties with India and Southeast Asia. He restructured export programs and financial tools to help Canadian companies find markets beyond America. And it worked. Suddenly, a Canadian glassblower like Curtis Dion could find buyers in Germany. A Quebec maple syrup cooperative was shipping to Dubai. Canadian beef hit the plates of South Korean families. The U.S. was no longer the only option. It was just one market among many. The New North, rediscovering home. At the same time, Carney knew that resilience wasn't just about going abroad. It was about looking inward. He encouraged Canadians to invest in their own communities, support local, travel local, build local. What emerged was not just an economic shift, but a cultural one. Canadians began falling in love with their own country again. Cottage rentals exploded. Indigenous tourism programs grew. Local artisans saw record sales. For the first time in decades, the gravitational pull of American culture weakened, and Canadian identity surged. This wasn't a retreat. It was a revelation. Canada didn't need to orbit Washington's chaos. It had everything it needed within its borders and across its own international alliances. Trump's self-inflicted isolation. As Canada diversified, America alienated. Trump's America First doctrine became a blueprint for America alone. Longtime allies became targets. Trade agreements became threats. Institutions like NATO, the WTO, and the G7 were mocked or undermined. Global confidence in the U.S. plummeted. Investor certainty declined. Countries began bypassing the dollar. Even reliable partners like Germany, France, and Japan started hedging against American unpredictability. While Carney was building coalitions, Trump was burning bridges. And when the economic storm hit, rising inflation, supply chain breakdowns, energy shocks, it was clear who had prepared and who had postured. The border that became a wall. Perhaps the most symbolic transformation was psychological. The border between Canada and the U.S. used to be the friendliest on earth. Now, it feels like a warning sign. Where once there was cooperation, now there is suspicion. Where once there was integration, now there is divergence. Canadians no longer see the U.S. as a safe backup plan. It's become a cautionary tale. And Americans? Many, especially in blue states, look north with envy at functioning health care, economic stability, and leadership that doesn't rely on rage. July 21st and the future of North American trade. As the deadline for new trade negotiations looms, Canada stands ready, but not desperate. Carney has made it clear, if the U.S. returns to the table with threats, Canada walks. If Trump or any future president wants a partnership, it must be based on respect, not fear. This isn't about revenge. It's about recognition. Canada is no longer a junior partner. It's a sovereign, strategic, and globally connected economy. The new trade deals will reflect that. And if the U.S. refuses to adapt, then it will find itself isolated, watching its former allies build a future without it. Trump's trade war with Canada was meant to intimidate. Instead, it inspired a national awakening. Under Carney's leadership, Canada didn't just survive, it evolved. This isn't a story about tariffs. It's a story about leadership. Trump's broken empire is crumbling because it was built on ego, not economics. Carney's Canada is thriving because it was built on resilience, strategy, and unity. The cold revenge wasn't loud. It wasn't flashy. It came in the form of calm negotiation, strategic diversification, and a people who decided that their country was worth defending with their votes, their voices, and yes, their wallets. And in that quiet, powerful rebellion, Canada shut the door on Trump's empire and opened a new one for itself. The long game, how Carney's patience redefined sovereignty. What Donald Trump never understood and likely never will is that true power isn't in the roar, it's in the results. While Trump barked across podiums, launched tariff grenades, and reduced diplomacy to a WWE sideshow, Mark Carney was executing a masterclass in national resilience. Slowly, steadily, Canada was pulling away from the gravitational chaos of Washington, not with hostility, with clarity. Carney's focus on internal strength, streamlining interprovincial commerce, boosting domestic infrastructure, and digitizing supply networks, transformed Canada from an export-addicted economy to a more agile, self-sustaining one. Provinces once mired in red tape over transport and distribution now began operating like a coordinated machine. And as a result, Canadian businesses were no longer trapped by the whims of American policy. They had options. The psychology of stability. There's a powerful signal sent when a nation does not flinch in crisis. Carney's calm, firm demeanor projected not just competence, but confidence. Investors took notice. CEOs breathed easier. Public trust soared. And unlike Trump, whose every tweet could tank the stock market or rattle global bonds, Carney's words brought order. This contrast could not be more glaring. Trump treated governance as performance art, where volatility was a feature, not a flaw. Markets braced for disruption, not direction. Meanwhile, Carney cultivated predictability, the one currency more valuable than any dollar. Under his stewardship, Canada became a refuge for rational investment. Canada as a model for moderate power. In a world increasingly polarized between superpower egos and populist flare-ups, Canada, under Carney's watch, positioned itself as the exemplar of moderate power. No one expected Canada to lead global hegemony. But quietly, through stable policy, global cooperation, and economic discipline, it became something just as potent, reliable. Countries disillusioned with American instability began deepening ties with Ottawa. Trade missions expanded. Intelligence sharing agreements broadened. Even tech innovation alliances, once dominated by Silicon Valley, saw new hubs emerge in Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver. Canada's brand wasn't flash. It was trust, the human cost of Trump's theater. Back in the U.S., Trump's tariffs and bluster were leaving more than economic damage. They were leaving lives broken. From Pennsylvania steel workers laid off due to retaliatory Canadian duties, to Midwest farmers watching Chinese contracts evaporate overnight, the casualties piled up. It became clear this wasn't America first. It was America fumbled. Even American tourism to Canada dwindled, not due to restrictions, but embarrassment. Liberal-minded Americans, ashamed of their country's belligerence, stayed home. Canadians, in turn, stopped opening their wallets to U.S. retailers. Economic friendship was replaced by icy pragmatism. Neighbors no more. Cultural reclamation in the North. One of the least discussed yet most profound effects of this shift has been cultural. For decades, Canada lived in the cultural shadow of the United States, Hollywood, Wall Street, Broadway. But as tensions grew, so did national self-awareness. Canadian film festivals, once niche, gained mainstream traction. Local TV productions like Schitt's Creek captured international acclaim. Canadian artists, entrepreneurs, and storytellers found new pride in being distinct from their American counterparts, not in defiance, but in affirmation. Carney's economic independence sparked a cultural one. Canada wasn't just stabilizing its economy, it was redefining its identity. The Great Decoupling. Trade data began telling a new story. Where once 80% of Canada's exports were U.S.-bound, that figure began to fall. Europe's share grew, so did South Asia's. This wasn't reactionary, it was strategic. Carney and his economic advisors weren't interested in revenge. They were interested in insurance. If Trump or another populist ever weaponized trade again, Canada wouldn't be left in the cold. The economy would still run. Jobs would still be protected. The lifelines wouldn't all point south. This decoupling didn't mean isolation. It meant insulation. Canada was becoming stormproof. The cost of losing a partner. But for America, the cost was incalculable. Canada wasn't just a trade partner. It was a buffer, a continental ally that shared intelligence, energy grids, and water systems. Losing Canada's goodwill doesn't just hurt auto exports. It fractures the geopolitical fabric of North America. Trump's team seemed to think that Canada, dependent on U.S. markets, would eventually bend. But instead, Ottawa pivoted. And now, with American global influence waning, the U.S. faces an uncomfortable reality. It alienated one of its closest friends over a failed bluff. Carney's lessons for the next generation. One of the most telling aspects of the saga is how Carney framed the trade dispute to the Canadian public. He didn't whip up fear. He didn't villainize. He used the moment to educate on economic literacy, on global trade, on interdependence. And in doing so, he raised the bar for civic discourse. Students were taught how trade flows work. Workers were shown how diversification protects jobs. Citizens were included in the solution, not just the suffering. This created not just an informed public, but a resilient one. By contrast, Trump fueled resentment and misinformation. His base was told lies about job creation and foreign theft, when the real culprits were automation, deregulation, and mismanagement. Rather than empowering Americans with knowledge, he poisoned them with scapegoats. What comes after Trump? Even if Donald Trump is no longer president, the scars remain. His policies accelerated a global trend of de-dollarization. His attacks on allies fractured long-standing coalitions. His sabotage of climate accords and trade pacts left void that others, China, Russia, even regional blocs, are rushing to fill. But Canada didn't wait for Trump to exit the stage. Carney knew the damage was deeper than one man. It was systemic. That's why the reforms were structural, permanent, future-proof. The idea was simple. Never again will Canada hinge its prosperity on the personality of an American president. The future is multipolar, and Canada is ready. As global power diffuses, and trade no longer flows through a single economic hegemon, countries like Canada have an opportunity. not to dominate, but to influence, to set the tone, to lead on issues like digital regulation, green finance, ethical AI, and food security. Carney's approach laid the groundwork for that leadership, not with speeches, but with systems, with infrastructure, with alliances that look not for loudness, but for leadership. And now, as the U.S. reels from its own political whiplash, the door is wide open for a quieter, smarter power to shape the agenda. Trump may have thought Canada would cave, that its politeness was weakness, that its economy was his to manipulate. But what he missed, what every bully misses, is that silence isn't surrender. It's strategy. Canada didn't retaliate with rage. It responded with resolve. And in the long, slow thaw of a once-strong alliance, it's clear who's prepared for the next season and who's stuck in the last. Because while Trump broke deals and bragged about walls, Carney was building bridges to a future where sovereignty isn't about strength alone, but about the wisdom to use it well. One of the more destructive legacies of Donald Trump's economic tantrums wasn't just the direct damage to trade. It was the erosion of trust. For decades, the U.S. relied on a network of stable partnerships to anchor its global influence. Canada wasn't just a northern neighbor. It was a cornerstone of continental integration, trusted, reliable, and ideologically aligned. Trump shattered that foundation not through necessity, but through narcissism. By slapping tariffs on Canada under the pretense of national security, Trump sent a chilling message. America's word is conditional. Treaties? Optional. Friendship? Negotiable. Cooperation? Only if you flatter the ego in charge. And just like that, the world, Canada included, began recalibrating their dependencies. Canada understood that trust, once broken, doesn't bounce back on a news cycle. That's why Carney's strategy wasn't just reactive. It was transformative. He didn't aim to restore the status quo. He aimed to replace it with something more durable, sovereign independence powered by global balance. Carney's economic patriotism. Patriotism in economic terms isn't about slapping flags on factories or shaming global trade. It's about defending the dignity and stability of your workforce. Carney embodied this principle with every policy move. Rather than play Trump's game of punitive tariffs, Carney focused inward, strengthening small businesses, investing in high-tech manufacturing, and supporting worker retraining programs to future-proof Canadian labor. He paired these domestic efforts with robust international outreach, not to grovel, but to diversify. Canada's new trade agreements with the EU, CETA, and its deepening ties to India and ASEAN nations weren't symbolic. They were a deliberate break from the dangerous over-reliance on a partner whose leadership had become erratic and vindictive. This was economic patriotism with foresight, protecting not just today's jobs, but tomorrow's industries. From integration to insulation, Canada's new doctrine. For decades, North American trade was defined by deep integration, shared supply chains, harmonized regulations, and synchronized logistics. Trump broke that model. But instead of fighting to rebuild it as it was, Carney pushed for something new, strategic insulation. Rather than tying Canadian prosperity to U.S. stability, the Carney Doctrine emphasized redundancy, dual sourcing, domestic production, national stockpiles, energy autonomy. What had once seemed unnecessary, expensive even, was now essential. COVID-19 only reinforced this view. By the time Trump was demanding Canada fall and lie again, Canada didn't need to. It had already built an economy that could run regardless of who occupied the White House. The auto industry case study. Perhaps no sector better exemplifies this transformation than the automotive industry. For years, Canadian auto plants were tethered to the health of U.S. manufacturers. Trump's tariffs threw that interdependence into crisis. Plants paused production. Workers were furloughed. Parts shortages rippled across the border. Instead of pleading for relief, Carney focused on reshaping the sector. He worked with provincial premiers to offer targeted incentives for electric vehicle, EV, production in Ontario and Quebec. He invited Japanese and European automakers to expand northward. He linked EV manufacturing to Canada's critical mineral strategy, lithium, cobalt, and nickel. The message was clear. Canada isn't just a junior partner in someone else's factory plan. It's a driver of innovation and investment in its own right, the return of industrial strategy. Under Carney, Canada revived something many Western nations had abandoned: industrial strategy. While Trump loudly promised factories with no blueprint, Carney quietly delivered long-term plans grounded in real trends: green energy, digital transformation, and advanced manufacturing. In the end, the video shows us a global stage where Trump storms off in chaos, his empire fraying, his audience dwindling. And quietly, stage right, Carney steps forward, not with fireworks, but with facts. Not with ego, but with equilibrium. The crowd doesn't roar, but they listen, because in a world tired of shouting, the calm voice is power. And in a post-Trump economy, the steady hand is king.